Section 5 of A Year Amongst the Persians by Edward Granville Browne. Recording by Anthony Taubman. A Year Amongst the Persians by Edward Granville Browne. Chapter 3. From the Persian Frontier to Tabriz. چه خوش باشد که بعد از انتظاری به آمدی رسید امیدواری. How good it is when one with waiting tired obtaineth that which he hath long desired. Sa'di. کنج عزلت که طلسمت عجب دارد فتحیان در نظر همت دوشن است. The talisman of magic might, hid in some ruin's lonely site, emerges from its ancient night at the mild glance of dervishes. Hafiz, rendered by Herman Bicknell. There is always a pleasant sense of excitement and expectation in entering for the first time a foreign country. Especially is this the case when to visit that country has long been the object of one's ambition. Yet that which most sharply marks such a transition, and most forcibly reminds the traveller that he is amongst another race, I mean a change of language, is not so observable by one who enters Persia from the northwest. For the inhabitants of the province of Azerbaijan, which forms this portion of the Persian Empire, uniformly employ a dialect of Turkish, which, though differing widely from the speech of the Ottoman Turks, is not so far removed from it as to render either language unintelligible to those who speak the other. If amongst the better classes in the towns of Azerbaijan, and here and there in the villages, the Persian language is understood or spoken, it is as a foreign tongue acquired by study or travel, while the narrow, affected enunciation of the vowels, so different from the bold, broad pronunciation of Persia proper, and the introduction of the Y sound after K and G, at once serve to mark the province to which the speaker belongs. It is not until Qazvin is reached, and only 4 or 5 stages separate the traveller from Tehran, that the Persian distinctly predominates over the Turkish language, while even 4 stages south of the capital, as far as the sacred city of Qom, the latter is still generally understood. The country immediately beyond the frontier was as desolate and devoid of cultivation as that which we had just quitted, and it was not until we reached the Persian frontier village of Ajavit that we have any opportunity of observing that change of costume which constitutes the other great sign of entry amongst a new race. Indeed, the approach of night which overtook us ere we reached our destination prevented us even then from getting more than a very partial idea of the differences which distinguish a Persian from a Turkish village. So far as we could see, however, the change was distinctly for the better. The square houses, built of unbaked clay, were clean and commodious, while a goodly array of poplar trees gave to the place an appearance of verdure, which contrasted pleasantly with our too vivid recollections of the hideous waste of Diadin. Immediately on our arrival, we sent our letter of introduction, which had been given to us by the Persian consul at Erzurum, to Pasha Khan, the Sahadar, or Warden of the Marches, intending to pay our respects to him in the morning before our departure. While we were eating our supper, however, a message came from him to say that he would, if we pleased, receive us at once, as he was in the habit of rising late. As this invitation was practically equivalent to a command, we hastened, in spite of our weariness and disinclination to move, to respond to it, and were presently ushered by our host, who was one of the great man's retainers, into the presence of Pasha Khan, having previously removed our boots on an intimation from the Farashes, who stood at the door of the presence chamber. we were invited to seat ourselves on the floor opposite the frontier chief, who sat in a corner of the room on the side next the door, reclining on cushions. On one side of him was seated his vazir, on the other a grim-looking secretary, whose face was adorned with a pair of fierce moustaches, and whose hand still held the letter of introduction which he had been reading to Pasha Khan. The warden of the marches conversed with me for a short time, in a somewhat fitful manner, in Persian, inquiring particularly about the terms on which England stood with Russia. Seeing, however, that he was disinclined to prolong the interview, and that he appeared moody and preoccupied, a fact due, as we subsequently learnt, to a quarrel which had arisen between him and his brother, we were preparing to take our leave when several servants entered bearing trays of pilau and sherbet, of which, though we had already supped, we were compelled by politeness to partake. The sherbet was excellent, as was also the pilau, consisting of pieces of lamb's flesh buried in rice, which we had to eat, awkwardly enough, with our hands. This accomplishment, which, in spite of assiduous efforts, I never succeeded in thoroughly acquiring, is far from being so easy as might at first sight appear. The rice is pressed by the 4 fingers into a wedge-shaped bolus, which is then thrust into the mouth by an upward motion of the terminal joint of the thumb placed behind it. Any grains of rice which remain clinging to the fingers must then be collected by a semicircular sweep of the thumb into another smaller bolus, which is then eaten before a fresh handful of rice is taken up. It is wonderful what dexterity the Persians acquire in this method of eating, which is indeed far more cleanly and convenient than might be supposed. To the foreigner, however, it is hardly less difficult of acquisition than the Persian manner of sitting on the heels, and, if on the first attempt we did not meet with the ridicule of our entertainers, it was rather from their politeness than from any dexterity on our part. On the conclusion of the meal we took our leave, Pasha Khan ordering our host in his capacity of Farosh to accompany us on our journey as far as Kara Ayne. For this we were very grateful, not so much because we hoped for any advantage from our escort, as because we feared that it might be larger, for a large escort naturally involves considerable expense. Next day, 24th October, we started a little before 8 a.m, and we were now able to contrast the appearance of the numerous villages through which we had passed with those of the Turkish side of the frontier. The comparison was certainly very much to the advantage of Persia. The houses, surrounded by gardens of poplars, were neater, cleaner, and better built than is usual in Turkey, while nearly every village contained at least one house of considerable size. The change in the costume of the people was equally striking. The fez had entirely disappeared, and its place was taken either by the thickly lined, close-fitting skull cap of cloth trimmed with black wool, which is called shikari, or by the hideous long-haired papakh of black or brown colour, which I have already noticed as constituting the headdress of our muleteers. Before we had gone very far, we were overtaken by 2 more of Pasha Khan's mounted irregulars, who appeared desirous of attaching themselves to us as an additional escort, in spite of our unwillingness to accept their services. About 2 p.m. we reached the village of Kara Ayne, which was to be our halting place for the night. Hearing that there was a bazaar, I was minded to visit it, but found it to be a single shop kept by a leper, whose stock in trade appeared to consist chiefly of small tawdry mirrors and very rank tobacco. On the following day we were joined by 2 more armed horsemen, making 5 in all, so that our cavalcade now presented a most imposing appearance, and there seemed to be every chance that, at this rate of proceeding, we should accumulate a small army before reaching Tabriz, in order, as I believe, to sustain our flagging faith in their utility, and to convince us of the danger of the road. An alarm of robbers was started by our escort as we were traversing a narrow defile, assuring us that only 3 days ago 3 men had been robbed and murdered in this very spot. They galloped wildly ahead, now cautiously ascending and peeping over the summit of a hillock, now madly descending it at breakneck speed, and scouring across the country. In the caravan, all were huddled together in a compact mass, and, in spite of our scepticism, Ali insisted on the rifle being got ready for action, while he continued to brandish an old sword, which he had bought at Erzurum, in the most truculent manner. Notwithstanding all these preparations, no robbers appeared, and after we had been sufficiently entertained by the evolutions of our escort, we were permitted to lapse once more into tranquillity. Early in the afternoon, after fording a river, the eminently picturesque bridge being broken down, and passing a pretty hamlet situated by the side of a stream, we arrived at the village of Zorawa, where we halted for the night. Here we obtained very fair quarters in the house of a fine-looking old man with some knowledge of Persian. 4 or 5 of the inhabitants came in to stare at us and to smoke their kalyans, hubble-bubbles, with intermittent attempts to mend a broken door. Ali struck up a great friendship with our host, and inspired by this, and the reflection that on the morrow we should reach a town of some importance, made him a present of all that remained of our tea. Next day, 26th October, we found to our delight that our escort was reduced to 2, who still continued their attempts to scare us with alarms of robbers. Whether the road was indeed dangerous I do not know, but it was certainly amazingly bad. About midday, on emerging from a very fine gorge, we saw at our feet a wide and cultivated plain, surrounded almost entirely by mountains, except to the right, in the direction of Urumiyeh. In this plain lay the beautiful little city of Khoi, and, somewhat nearer to us, the suburb of Pire, both surrounded by a mass of gardens. The latter we reached in about an hour, and here we rested for a while. Thence onwards to the very walls of Khoi, appropriately styled Darus Safar, the abode of delight. Our way lay through pleasant gardens of poplars, willows, and fruit trees, and fields planted with cotton. At 3:30 p.m. we entered the town and put up at a clean and well-constructed caravanserai. While the baggage was being unloaded, I perceived that we were undergoing an attentive scrutiny on the part of a magnificent-looking dervish, who wore on his head a green turban, of which one end depended over his shoulder, and carried in his hand a shining battle-axe. Presently he began to address inquiries to Ali, and, on learning from him that I spoke Persian, approached me and entered into conversation. He proved to be a native of Kerman, Mir Jalal al-Din by name, and his extraordinary fertility of imagination, which often carried him far beyond the bounds not only of the probable but of the possible, rendered him a very amusing companion, if not a very reliable informant. He at once constituted himself our guide, philosopher, and friend, and hardly quitted us during the 3 days which we spent at Khoi, declaring that he perceived us to be excellent fellows, worthy of his society and conversation. He assured us that he had travelled much, and had thrice visited London, once in company with the Shah, that he had instructed members of the Russian royal family in Persian, and that besides this, his native tongue, he was conversant with no less than 10 languages, including Kurdish, Russian, and the dialect of Sistan on the eastern frontier of Persia. Having given us these details about himself, he began to question us as to our destination, and on learning that we were bound for Tabriz, told us that we must on no account omit to visit the towns of Salmas, Khusravabad, and Dilmaghan, more especially the latter, in which as he declared, there were no less than 1,000 English residents, who, through converse with dervishes and Sufis, had become enlightened and philosophical. While we were engaged in conversation, a man entered the room to inquire our names and whence we came, the object for which this information was sought being, as Mir Jalal al-Din informed us with perfect gravity, that it might be inserted in the newspapers of Tabriz. His imagination being now temporarily exhausted, our worthy friend bade us good night, and promising to be with us betimes in the morning, and to show us something of the town, left us to repose. Our first business on awaking in the morning was to make inquiries as to the possibility of obtaining a bath in the adjacent hammam, and this indulgence was without difficulty accorded to us. On our return, we found our friend the dervish awaiting our arrival. He at once launched out into a disquisition on things pertaining to his order. The true arif, or adept, he informed us, was distinguished by 4 external signs: the tabar, or axe, which serves to protect him during his wanderings in the desert from ferocious beasts; the keshkid, or gourd slung on chains, in which he receives alms; the taj, or felt cap embroidered with texts, which crowns his head; and the gishu, or long locks, which fall over his shoulders. He then showed me some pills, compounded, as he assured me, after a prescription of the sage Lochman, of a substance called barsh, and known by the name of habe nishat, or pills of gladness. One of these he offered me to eat, assuring me that it would not fail to produce a most delightful sense of exhilaration and ecstasy. But, although I complied with his invitation, I failed to observe any such effect. About 11 a.m. we accompanied him for a stroll through the town. He first took us to a neighbouring caravanserai, and introduced us to a Syrian Christian of Urumiyeh, named Simon Abraham, who practised the trade of a photographer and spoke English, which he had learned from the missionaries settled at that place, very well. He, in his turn, introduced us to another Syrian Christian, called Dr. Samuel, who kept a dispensary at the opposite side of the caravanserai, and who likewise possessed a good knowledge of English. Both received us very cordially, and did much to render pleasant our sojourn at Khoi. In the afternoon we were taken by the indefatigable Mir Jalal al-Din to visit a tekiye, or retreat for dervishes, situated near the walls of the town. The dervishes, who were a most heterogeneous crew, including, besides Persians, Kurds and Negroes, received us very hospitably and gave us tea. On our return to the caravanserai, our companion introduced us to a ramal, or geomancer, who occupied a room adjacent to ours. This votary of the occult sciences, Mirza Taki by name, was a native of Kermanshah. So far as I could see, he never quitted his cell, dividing his time between opium smoking, tea drinking, and casting the 4 dice-like brass cubes pivoted together, whereby he essayed to unravel the mysteries of the future. After offering us a share of his tea, he proceeded to cast his dice and tell me my fortune, scribbling on a piece of paper the while. somewhat as follows: 3, 2, 1, 2, counting the numbers uppermost on the dice. Praise be to Allah! Thou wert born under a lucky star. 1, 1, 3, 4. Thy journey will be a long one, and 7 months at least will elapse ere thou shalt see again thy native land. 2, 2, 4, 2. I take refuge with Allah, the Supreme, the Mighty. What is it that I see? Thou shalt without doubt incur a great danger on the road, and indeed it seemeth to me that one will attempt thy life before thou reachest Tabriz. 4, 3, 1, 4. Thou hast already lost, or wilt shortly lose, 2 things of value. I immediately thought of my watch, and then recollected that I had informed Mir Jalal ad-Din of its loss. 4, 4, 2, 1. Our refuge is in God. A violent storm will overtake thee on thy voyage homewards, but from this thou wilt, Inshallah, escape by means of a talisman which I will prepare for thee. 3, 1, 1, 3. On thy return home thou wilt marry and have 4 sons and 3 daughters. 4, 2, 3, 1. Thou hast, alas, several powerful enemies, and an evil influence threatens thy star. But shouldst thou escape these, as, please God, thou wilt do, by the help of a charm which I will presently write for thee, thou wilt without doubt gain the favour of thy queen, and attain unto great prosperity, Inshallah. Thy fortune, he continued, sweeping up the implements of his craft, is, praise be to Allah, far from bad, a proof of which is that thou hast fallen in with one truly skilled in the occult sciences, and endowed with all kinds of knowledge, who is able not only to warn thee of the misfortunes which threaten thee, but also to provide thee with the means of averting, or at least of mitigating, the same. The talismans which thou needest now are as follows: 1, to protect thee from the attempt on thy life, which will be made before thou reachest Tabriz. 1, to ensure thy safety in the storm, which will assail thee on thy homeward voyage. 1... Honoured sir, I interrupted at this point, before giving you the trouble of writing so many charms, I would fain have some further proof of the efficacy of your science. I do not indeed, like many of my countrymen, deny its existence, but of its truth I would desire a proof which you can easily afford me. To describe the events of the past is without doubt less difficult than to predict those of the future. Tell me, then, the name of my birthplace, the number of my brothers and sisters, and the adventures which have already befallen me. Then, indeed, shall I know for certain that you are a skilful magician, and that the science which you practice is not, as some of my unbelieving countrymen assert, a vain and useless thing. Reasonable as this request appeared to me to be, it did not seem to meet with the approbation of the geomancer, who appeared suddenly to lose interest in the conversation, seeing which we withdrew to our own room, where we subsequently received a visit from our Syrian friends. Next morning, before I was dressed, Mir Jalal al-Din appeared with 2 small manuscripts, both of which, he said, belonged to a poor Sufi, who was willing to sell them for a small sum only because he was stricken down by a mortal disease. One of these manuscripts contained, besides the well-known philosophical poem of Sheikh Mahmud Shabestari, known as the Gulshan-e-Ruz, or Rose Garden of Mystery, a treatise on the mystical science of managing the breath, from which he read me several long extracts. The other consisted of a few scattered pages from a work on medicine, which, he gravely informed me, had been written by the hand of Galen himself, and discovered by himself and a comrade amongst the ruins of one of the pyramids destroyed by the English. Not wishing to hurt the feelings of my ingenious friend by giving expression to my doubts, and thinking that some compensation was due to him for the trouble which he had been at to entertain us, I agreed to purchase these manuscripts for the moderate sum which he named. End of section 5.